The road to Willow Hill twisted like a ribbon of old secrets, climbing slowly into the mist-covered ridges of northern Vermont. The Harper estate sat at the summit like a memory no one wanted to forget, nor speak of, large, brooding, and draped in ivy that seemed more alive than the family who lived inside it. Emily Harper sat in the passenger seat of her husband's silver SUV, her eyes fixed on the narrow gravel road ahead. She hadn't spoken in nearly an hour, and neither had Richard. They were both lost in the silence that had come to define their marriage. Silent dinners, silent car rides, silent nights. But today felt heavier. The kind of silence that comes right before something is broken for good. "Still have reception," Richard said flatly, checking his phone. "Thought it'd be dead by now." Emily nodded, not really caring. She was watching the treetops blur past the window, wondering how many couples had come to this place thinking it would fix what was broken between them. They pulled up the winding driveway, and the house loomed into view. It was more imposing than she remembered from the photos. A 3-story Victorian with tall, narrow windows and a wraparound porch that creaked in the wind. The garden was overgrown, the shutters faded. It looked like it had once been proud, but time had bent its spine. "Welcome home," Richard said, with a bitter edge that made it sound more like a dare than a greeting. Emily didn't respond. She stepped out into the cool autumn air, pulling her coat tighter around her. The air smelled of wet leaves and old wood. There was something unnervingly still about the property. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before brushing past the porch. James Harper was waiting inside. He stood at the base of the staircase, posture straight as a soldier, though age had thinned his frame. His face, lined and somber, looked more like a portrait than a man. Sharp eyes beneath white brows, lips pressed together like a man who had unlearned speech. "Emily," he said, voice low and unreadable. "Professor Harper," she replied. "James," he corrected. "Your family now." She nodded, unsure how to respond. Something about his gaze made her feel stripped bare, as though he could see everything she hadn't said out loud. Richard brushed past them, carrying 2 duffel bags. "Guest rooms are upstairs. I'll take the one on the left." Emily blinked. "Aren't we sharing? Too much work tomorrow. Early flight. I need sleep." It wasn't new, this cold division. But saying it aloud, in front of his father, turned the knife just a little more. James said nothing. He simply turned and walked toward the sitting room. "Let me show you the rest of the house," he said over his shoulder. She followed. The house was dim, the curtains drawn. Dust clung to bookshelves and the edges of framed oil paintings. A grand piano sat untouched in the parlor, a stack of unopened letters resting on its lid. Everything felt preserved, like a museum curated by grief. They reached the sunroom at the back of the house. Light filtered through stained glass, casting fragmented rainbows across the floor. James stood silently beside her, looking out into the neglected garden. "He doesn't bring many people here," he said finally. Emily glanced at him. "Richard?" He nodded. "Not since his mother died. That was nearly 15 years ago. I didn't know." "There's a lot you don't know." The words hung there between them, not cruelly, but with a weight that demanded acknowledgement. Emily said nothing. She was tired of pretending things were okay. She had done that for years, waiting for Richard to come back, not just from flights, but from wherever he had gone emotionally. But he never did. Not really. Dinner that evening was quiet. James cooked, a surprisingly simple stew, bread, wine. Richard ate quickly, checked his phone between bites, and excused himself early. "I have a briefing call in the morning," he said. "Don't wait up." After he was gone, James and Emily sat across from each other in the candlelit dining room. The shadows made everything seem older, even them. "You're not happy," James said. It wasn't a question. Emily stared at her wine glass. "I don't think I ever was." He didn't press, just nodded, slowly, like he already knew. "You remind me of her," he said after a long pause. "Your wife." He nodded. "Catherine." She was always quiet, but not because she was timid. She watched, thought before she spoke. People underestimate that. Emily looked at him. For a moment, something cracked in her chest, a flicker of being seen. They sat in silence for a while longer, and then he stood. "There's a piano in the parlor," he said. "If you play." "I used to." "You still can." He left her with that. Later that night, after Richard's door had closed, Emily wandered down the hallway. The house creaked beneath her bare feet, the way old homes do, soft, groaning like the floorboards carried memories. She stepped into the parlor, lit only by the moonlight streaming through tall windows. She sat at the piano. The keys were dusty, but surprisingly in tune. She ran her fingers over them. C, G, a minor. It came back slowly, like a language once forgotten. Her hands trembled, but the notes were honest. Upstairs, James sat in his study, listening through the floorboards. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he did not feel alone in the house. And Emily, pressing into the melody, didn't realize that this would be the first night in months that she would fall asleep without waking from the weight on her chest. The following morning, Emily awoke to the sound of rain. Not the violent kind that thrashed against windows, but the quiet, persistent drizzle that made the world feel hushed. The kind of rain that lingered, not to destroy, but to remind. She lay still in bed for a while, listening. Somewhere in the house, floorboards creaked faintly, like someone moving through a dream. Richard was already gone. She found a note on the kitchen table, scribbled in quick, sharp handwriting. Meeting in Burlington. Back late. Don't wait up. R. There was no love, no warmth, not even a pretense of connection. Just facts. Instructions. Emily placed the note gently in the trash and turned toward the window. The rain blurred the glass, smearing the garden beyond into abstract greens and grays. Somewhere out there, behind the overgrowth and fallen leaves, she could see the outline of the small greenhouse James had mentioned during their house tour. It looked forgotten, almost swallowed by time. She made herself coffee, black, bitter, and stood in the doorway of the parlor, eyeing the piano. The memory of last night's music clung to her fingers like residue. It felt like something had stirred within her, something long buried beneath the routine of being someone else's shadow. She didn't play again, not yet. Instead, she wandered into the sunroom. James was already there, seated in an armchair, a book open on his lap. He didn't look up when she entered. The silence between them was not awkward, but intentional. Comfortable. "What are you reading?" she asked quietly, careful not to startle the moment. He lifted the book without taking his eyes off the page. Wendell Berry. Essays. Thought I'd revisit some old friends. Emily nodded, stepping farther into the room. The air was warmer here, touched by the faint scent of cedar and dried herbs. She sat in the chair across from him, unsure whether to speak again or simply sit with him in the hush of the rain. "You read?" he asked after a pause. "Not much lately. Used to. Poetry, mostly." That made him glance up. Just slightly. "What kind?" "Plath. Oliver. A bit of Rilke when I was brave enough." "Bravery isn't the point with Rilke," he said. "It's surrender." That made her smile. For a long while, they sat together, books and rain filling the spaces words usually rushed to occupy. There was a stillness to James, a kind of grounded presence that Emily had only ever seen in people who had suffered quietly and survived. Not unscarred, but intact. Somehow. It was mid-afternoon when he finally spoke again. "You should come to the garden." Emily raised an eyebrow. "In the rain?" He stood slowly, setting his book aside. "It's the best time." She followed him, slipping on her coat and stepping carefully through the back door onto the soft, wet grass. The garden had once been beautiful. She could see it now beneath the layers of neglect. Stone paths swallowed by ivy, rusting trellises where roses had once bloomed, and the faint outline of what had been a koi pond, now dry and cracked. James walked slowly, hands behind his back like a man in thought. This was Catherine's sanctuary, he said. She loved it more than the house itself. Emily said nothing, letting the space speak. The rain softened everything. The broken stones, the sagging branches, even the sorrow in his voice. "She used to say that silence is never empty," he continued. "It's just waiting for something worth filling it." Emily looked around. "Seems like a lot of waiting has happened here." He turned to face her, rain dripping from the ends of his white hair. "Maybe it's time we stop waiting." She looked at him, surprised, not just by his words, but by the way he said them. There was no weight of implication, no expectation. Just truth, an invitation to be present. That night, Richard didn't come home. His absence was not unusual, but it felt different this time. Less like avoidance, more like surrender. Emily sat alone at the kitchen table, a bowl of soup cooling in front of her. Her fingers played absently with the spoon, tracing circles in the broth. The silence was deep, pressing. She considered turning on the television, but didn't. She didn't want to drown anything out anymore. Instead, she returned to the parlor. The piano greeted her like an old friend, waiting patiently. She sat, touched the keys gently. This time, she didn't hesitate. The melody she played was not from any known piece. It was hers. Fragmented, unstructured, but raw and truthful. Notes fell like the rain outside, soft, continuous, asking nothing but to be heard. Upstairs, James listened again. He sat in the dark of his study, eyes closed, hands folded. The music was different tonight. Not sad, not joyful, but awakening. After the final note, Emily sat for a long while in silence. Her fingers rested on the keys as if afraid to let go. Then a voice came from the doorway. "You're better than you think." She turned sharply. James stood there, leaning slightly on the frame, arms crossed. "You should have told me you were listening," she said, voice low. "You should have known." He stepped into the room slowly, deliberately, and sat in the armchair across from the piano. There was no tension, only the gravity of something unspoken pressing gently into the space between them. "I haven't played for anyone since college," she said. "You didn't play for me," he replied. "You played for yourself. That's what made it honest." Emily looked down. Her heart thudded somewhere deep and distant. James leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Music like that only comes out of people who've been silenced. She met his gaze. "I've been quiet a long time." He nodded, as if he'd known all along. Then he stood. "It's late," he said. "Sleep well, Emily." She watched him go, unsure whether she felt seen or exposed. That night, she dreamed of a younger version of herself, barefoot in the garden, chasing wine through wild roses. And somewhere in the distance, a melody followed her, quiet and haunting. It was the first time in years she woke up wanting to dream again. It was 3 days before Richard returned. He walked in just before midnight, smelling faintly of whiskey and hotel linens, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, eyes glassy but not apologetic. Emily was on the couch, a book open on her lap, though she hadn't read a word in over an hour. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door and stood there for a moment, like he wasn't sure whether to speak or go straight upstairs. "You weren't answering your phone," she said evenly. "I was busy," he replied, as if that explained everything. "I thought something happened." He looked at her then, eyes narrowing. "Something did. Work happened. Clients. Meetings. Life. You could try understanding that once in a while." Emily closed her book, setting it gently on the table. "It's not about your work, Richard. It's about your silence." He laughed, short, sharp, defensive. "Funny, coming from you." She said nothing. There was no winning in this space between them, only bruises rearranged into new shapes. He walked past her, up the stairs, his footsteps a slow thunder that faded into the ceiling. The next morning, the house felt colder. Richard left early without a word, the car tires grinding against the gravel as he drove away. Emily watched from the upstairs window, arms wrapped around herself, wondering how long two people could live in the same house without ever truly meeting. She spent the rest of the morning in the garden. It had become a kind of ritual, pulling weeds, untangling vines, brushing fallen leaves off forgotten stones. There was something sacred in the reclamation. Each gesture felt like a small return, like she was gathering pieces of herself from the earth. James found her there just after noon, kneeling beside the dry pond. "You've made progress," he said. "I like the quiet out here. It suits you." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "Did Catherine spend a lot of time here?" James nodded. "Every day, until the very end." Emily hesitated. "Did she die here?" His eyes softened. "Yes, in the sunroom. She wanted to be surrounded by the things she loved. And you stayed." "I promised her I wouldn't leave this house until I understood why it kept us." Emily looked around. "Have you?" "Not yet, but I'm starting to think the house wasn't waiting for me." Their eyes met. It was a brief moment, but it held something unspoken, an acknowledgement of shared solitude, of quiet wounds that recognized each other. That afternoon, James invited her to his study for the first time. The room was lined with shelves, every wall brimming with books. Leather-bound, frayed paperbacks, annotated classics. A fire crackled gently in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the room. He handed her a slim volume. "Rilke, I thought you might appreciate this," he said. "You once said you were brave enough." She opened to a marked page. It was one of his letters, the ones filled with aching clarity. Perhaps everything terrible is in its deepest being something helpless that wants help from us. She read it aloud, softly, like a prayer. James watched her with something like reverence, as if her voice gave new breath to the words. I used to read these when I felt like I was disappearing, she said. They reminded me that silence didn't mean emptiness. He smiled. That's exactly right. They talked for hours, about books, memory, loss, music. She told him about the first song she ever learned on piano, a lullaby her mother used to hum. He told her about the night he and Catherine decided to buy the house, how she fell in love with its broken corners and whispered echoes. It was the first time in years that Emily felt intellectually alive. Not just heard, but engaged, valued for more than what she could hold together on the surface. That evening, she cooked dinner. Nothing extravagant, just roasted vegetables, rice, and garlic bread. But when James sat down at the table and tasted the first bite, he said quietly, Catherine would have approved. Emily smiled, shy and surprised by how much the comment warmed her. Richard came home late again, said nothing, didn't touch the food. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She paced the hallway, the piano's melody from the previous night still echoing faintly in her memory. She paused outside the study. The door was ajar, light spilling out in a narrow beam. James was there, sitting in his chair, book closed in his lap. I didn't mean to wake you, she said. You didn't. She stepped inside. Do you ever wonder what your life might have been if one decision had been different? He nodded. Every day, but not in a way that leads to regret. More like wondering what shape the rain might have taken had the wind blown another direction. She sat on the edge of the low couch, folding her hands. I feel like I've been someone else's shadow for so long that I don't remember what my own light looks like. James looked at her. Really looked. You still have it. It's just been dimmed by people who were afraid of it. She exhaled, a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. For a while, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The fire crackled softly. The rain had returned, pattering against the windows in a slow, rhythmic cadence. James finally stood, walked to the shelf, and pulled out a different book, his own old journal, its leather worn with age. I want to show you something, he said. He opened to a page near the center. There, written in small, neat handwriting, was a poem. Not copied, but original. Emily leaned forward, reading it slowly. It was about a woman in the garden, whose silence shook the wind, whose footsteps softened stone, whose music grew where nothing else could. She turned to him, startled. You wrote this recently. He nodded. About me. He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. In that moment, the boundaries between them trembled. Not broken, not crossed, but questioned. What began as sympathy was evolving into something more dangerous, more profound. Emily stood slowly. I should go, she whispered. James nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. But as she reached the doorway, he said quietly, for what it's worth, I see you. She stopped, and for the first time since she arrived at Willow Hill, she believed it. For days after that night in the study, Emily avoided the room. She kept to the garden, the kitchen, the piano, places where memory couldn't press in so tightly. She still saw James, over coffee, in passing glances, across the table, but something had shifted. Not in his behavior, not outwardly, but in the air between them. A quiet, pressing awareness. Like they were both standing at the edge of a cliff, pretending the wind wasn't pulling them forward. Richard, meanwhile, had grown more distant than ever. He left early, came home late, barely spoke, barely looked at her. Emily had stopped expecting anything from him. Not kindness, not cruelty. He had become a ghost in his own home, haunting rooms with his absence. One evening, after another silent dinner, Emily found herself at the piano again. Her fingers moved without thought, coaxing out melodies she hadn't realized she remembered. The music felt like a language she had lost and found again, wordless but full of meaning. James didn't interrupt this time. He stood in the hallway, just out of sight, listening. And when she finished, she let her hands rest on the keys. She knew he was there. She didn't need to see him to feel his presence. You're playing differently, he said after a moment. How so? Less careful, like you're letting something out. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. Maybe I am. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind thread its way through the trees. Her mind replayed moments like old film reels, The sound of James's voice when he read aloud. The way his eyes softened when he spoke about Catherine. The warmth in the study. There had been no betrayal. Not yet. But the ground was softening beneath her feet. She didn't know what scared her more. That something might happen, or that it already had, in the quiet places no one could see. 2 days later, it happened. It was raining again, heavier this time. Thunder growled somewhere in the distance, and the windows trembled slightly in their frames. Emily was in the sunroom, staring out at the garden. James entered without a word and handed her a cup of tea. "Thank you," she said quietly. He sat across from her, one leg crossed over the other. The room smelled faintly of peppermint and cedar. Outside, the rain struck the glass in irregular rhythms. "You seem far away," he said. "I'm trying not to be. Are you afraid of something?" Emily turned to face him fully. "Yes." James didn't push. She took a breath. "I'm afraid that I'm waking up." He tilted his head slightly. "And that scares you?" "It terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I don't know what's left of me. I've been asleep for so long. I don't know who I am without the silence." James leaned forward, setting his cup down. "You are not your past, Emily. You are not your marriage, or the spaces between what you say and what you want to say. You're allowed to become someone else. You're allowed to change." The way he said it, calm, assured, without expectation, made her chest tighten. "I want to believe that," she whispered. He looked at her then, really looked. Not as a father-in-law, not as a man burdened by propriety, but as someone who had lived long enough to recognize the breaking point in another person. And something between them cracked. It wasn't planned. It wasn't discussed. There was no rush, no desperation. It began with a touch, his hand brushing hers. She didn't move away. Their fingers interlaced slowly, like they had always known how to fit. He leaned forward, hesitating just long enough for her to meet him halfway. And then, silence. A kiss, so gentle it felt like breath. It was not lustful. It was not reckless. It was the kind of kiss that only happens between two people who have been starving for years. Not for bodies, but for understanding. When they pulled away, the rain outside had softened, but the air between them had changed. Emily stood up first. "I need to think." James nodded. "I understand." She walked out of the room with a kind of grace that didn't feel like running, but wasn't quite staying either. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the piano with the lid closed, her fingers resting on the wood like she was listening for something inside it. She felt no guilt. Not yet. Only the tremble of possibility and the ache of everything she had denied herself for so long. The next morning, Richard found her in the kitchen, stirring coffee she hadn't drunk. He looked more tired than usual, like the late nights were wearing on him. "You're quiet lately," he said. Emily looked up. "You just haven't been listening." He flinched, barely. "Is there something you want to say?" "Yes," she said. "But not to you." His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," she said, placing the cup down firmly, "that I've been living in a marriage with no words. And I've found someone who sees me. Someone who doesn't just walk past me every morning like I'm a fixture in his home." Richard stared at her. His jaw clenched. "Who?" he asked, his voice cold. Emily said nothing. He stepped forward. "Emily." "Who?" She met his gaze. "Your father." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time in years, and realizing he had never really looked at all. Then he turned, walked out the door, and drove off. Emily didn't follow. Instead, she went upstairs, closed her bedroom door, and cried for the version of herself that had been buried long before this moment. She cried for the silence, for the distance, for the years spent invisible. But most of all, she cried because she was finally choosing to be seen, even if it cost her everything. Downstairs, the house creaked softly, as if shifting its weight. And somewhere in the parlor, the piano waited. Richard didn't come back that night, nor the next. Emily didn't call. She didn't text. She didn't apologize. She didn't try to explain. She knew there were no words that could undo what had happened. No neat rationalization that would make it palatable or forgivable. But more than that, she knew the rift between them hadn't been caused by a single moment. It had been growing for years, long before James. Long before Willow Hill. It was a quiet ending to something that had been quiet for too long. James kept his distance. He no longer lingered in the study when she walked past. No longer brought her tea in the rain. They shared polite conversation, brief glances, careful silence. not coldness, but a kind of reverent space, as if neither knew what to do with what had already been done. Then the morning sickness began. At first, Emily told herself it was stress, the upheaval, the guilt, the hormones from years of being off balance. But by the third week, when she found herself doubled over in the upstairs bathroom, forehead pressed to the cool tile floor, she knew. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a wave, not sharp, but slow and suffocating. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding the positive test in her hand, feeling like time had folded in on itself. The air felt heavy. Her heart beat too fast. Her mind refused to settle on any one thought. She didn't cry. Instead, she stared at the tiny blue lines and whispered to the empty room, "What do I do now?" The answer didn't come that day, or the next, but the question stayed with her like a second heartbeat. She didn't tell James. Not at first. Not because she wanted to hide it, but because she didn't yet know if she wanted him to hope or to grieve. In the meantime, she tried to function. She ate what she could. She played the piano when her hands stopped trembling long enough. She walked the overgrown paths in the garden and pressed her fingers to the soil like it might give her a sign. The garden was changing. Slowly, life creeping back in. And maybe, she thought, so was she. A week later, Richard returned. He didn't knock, just opened the door and walked in like it was any other day. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, slicing apples for tea. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes unreadable. "I didn't come back to fight," he said. "Then why are you here?" He looked around the room like he barely recognized it. Or her. "I wanted to see for myself." See what? What kind of woman would burn down her own life? Emily set the knife down slowly. "I didn't burn it down," she said. "It was already ash. I just stopped pretending it wasn't." Richard stepped closer, but not threateningly. He looked tired, worn. His voice lost its edge. "Do you love him?" She hesitated. Not because she didn't know, but because she didn't know how to explain it. "I don't know if it's love," she said finally. "I just know that when I'm around him, I feel like myself. And I don't hate that version of me." Richard sat across from her. They were quiet for a long time. "I was never good at being your husband," he admitted. "I didn't know how to give you what you needed." Emily nodded slowly. "And I didn't know how to ask." He looked down at the table. "I think we were both trying to survive a life we didn't choose." Neither of them cried. It wasn't that kind of goodbye. It was quiet, honest, exhausted. Richard stood and reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. "I'm filing for separation. There's no point dragging this out." She unfolded the document and read the top line. Her name, his, date of marriage, grounds, mutual incompatibility. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Take care of yourself, Emily." "You too, Richard." And just like that, he left. A door closed. A chapter ended. The house felt different in the days that followed. Lighter, but also more fragile. James noticed. He said nothing directly, but his glances lingered longer. His footsteps near her door paused for an extra second. He made coffee when she forgot. Set out fruit she could eat. Emily wanted to tell him. Needed to. But every time she opened her mouth, something caught in her throat. She didn't know how to say, "I'm carrying your child," without it sounding like a punishment. But life, as always, doesn't wait for perfect timing. She was in the garden when it happened, bent over, pulling weeds, when a sharp pain knifed through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching at her side, falling forward onto her knees. The world tilted. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. James found her minutes later, curled against the ivy-covered stones, pale and shaking. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms and carried her inside. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Flashing lights, sterile halls, nurses in soft-soled shoes, a doctor with tired eyes and too many questions. How far along? Any bleeding? History of complications? Emily answered as best she could, her voice cracking. James sat beside her, silent, but present, his hand resting gently over hers, anchoring her to the moment. After hours of tests and waiting, the doctor returned. "You and the baby are okay," he said. "It was a scare, possibly stress-induced, but you'll need to rest. Strictly. No more gardening. No heavy lifting. And someone needs to monitor you." James exhaled audibly for the first time that day. Emily looked at the ceiling, tears sliding into her hair. It was real now. Undeniable. When they returned to Willow Hill, James helped her into bed, pulled the blanket over her, and sat beside her chair, staring at the floor. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. She turned her head toward him. "I was scared," she said, "that it would change everything. It already has." He looked up, eyes glassy but steady. "I know it's wrong. I know how the world would see this. But I don't care, Emily. I don't care what they say. I care that you're safe. That the baby's safe." She reached for his hand. "I'm still figuring out how to live in this," she said. "But I don't want to do it alone." James leaned forward, pressing her fingers to his lips. "You're not alone. Not anymore." And for the first time since the test, since the hospital, since everything, Emily allowed herself to believe it. The days following Emily's hospital visit settled into a new kind of rhythm. James adjusted his entire world around her recovery. He stopped teaching his remote literature seminars. He postponed his book club gatherings. He stocked the pantry with ginger tea and saltine crackers, learned how to cook quinoa and grilled vegetables, and kept a notebook on the kitchen counter where he wrote down everything the doctor had said, twice. Emily noticed everything. She noticed the way he never hovered, but was always nearby. The way he left a chair outside her bedroom door, not to watch, but to be close enough if she called. The way he spoke to her belly sometimes in passing, like the child already had a name. But she also noticed how often he stopped himself from touching her, from saying too much, as if loving her now, openly, was something he still hadn't fully given himself permission to do. In truth, neither had she. Pregnancy slowed her. It turned her thoughts inward. Some days, she woke hopeful, the kind of hope that dared to imagine raising a child in a world that would understand. Other days, she felt like she was walking through fog, uncertain whether she was building a future or running from the wreckage of her past. The garden outside began to fade into winter. Frost claimed the ivy. The last roses withered on the vine. And still, the house held them. Quietly, patiently. One morning, while folding linens in the upstairs hallway, Emily heard a car pull up the gravel drive. She walked slowly to the window and watched as a black sedan parked beneath the gnarled oak tree. A woman stepped out, tall, elegant, wrapped in a deep green wool coat. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was Margaret Harper, Richard's mother. She hadn't seen Margaret since the wedding. That day, the woman had worn a pale gray dress and a stiff smile, as if the entire ceremony had been a performance she'd agreed to attend, but not believe in. Emily walked to the front door and opened it before the knock came. "Mrs. Harper," she said. "Emily," the older woman replied. Her voice was still cool, but not sharp. "May I come in?" Emily stepped aside. "Of course." Margaret's eyes scanned the house quickly. She took in the scent of cinnamon from the kitchen, the soft piano music playing from the old speaker in the sitting room, the clean walls, and the vase of wilting daisies on the hall table. "It's cleaner than I imagined," she said. Emily didn't rise to the bait. James came down the stairs a moment later, surprised, but composed. "Mother." "James." They regarded each other for a long beat, two people bound by blood, but held apart by years of unsaid words. Margaret sat in the parlor. Emily brought tea. No one asked her to. The three of them sat in a tight triangle. James in the corner chair, Margaret on the settee, Emily on the ottoman near the window. "I heard about the divorce," Margaret said finally. Emily nodded. "It's happening. Papers are in." "And the pregnancy?" "Straight to it." Margaret had always been efficient. Emily met her gaze. "Yes." "Is it James's?" "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes, just briefly. "Well," she said, setting her teacup down with precision, "we've had our share of scandals in this family. I suppose it was time for another." Emily didn't know how to respond. James leaned forward, his voice steady. "Why are you here, Mother?" Margaret sighed, but not cruelly. "Because I'm old. And tired. And I don't want to die having never looked my grandchild's mother in the eye." Emily blinked. Margaret continued. "I was not kind to you when you married Richard. I saw you as soft. Weak. A girl who wouldn't last. I wasn't strong then," Emily admitted. "Not like I am now." "No," Margaret agreed. "But you lasted anyway." The room was still. The only sound came from the distant creaking of the house, settling deeper into itself. "I don't approve of what happened," Margaret said. "But I'm not here to punish you. I've lost too much time already, pretending to be above other people's pain." She stood, smoothing her coat. "When the baby is born, if you'll let me, I'd like to meet them." Emily's voice was soft. "You can." Margaret nodded once, like a deal had been struck. Then, turning to James, she said, "Take care of her. You've failed one woman already." He flinched, just slightly. But he nodded. "I won't fail again." After Margaret left, Emily stood on the porch for a long time, watching the car disappear down the hill. She felt oddly light. Not forgiven, but acknowledged. Not redeemed, but received. That night, she and James sat in the study again. The fire crackled between them. "I never thought she'd come," James said. "I think she wanted to see if we were broken," Emily said. "And maybe, if we weren't, she could forgive herself a little too." He looked at her. "Are we broken?" "No," Emily said. "But we're still rebuilding." They didn't kiss that night. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't distance anymore. It was space, room for something new to grow. In the days that followed, James began to write again. Not academic articles, not lectures, but stories. Short ones, strange ones. About gardens and pianos and women who whispered to wind. Emily painted, for the first time in years. Small watercolors at first, then larger pieces, trees, shadows, the view from her bedroom window at dusk. The baby began to kick. At night, James would place his hand over her stomach and speak in poems, half serious, half silly. Emily would laugh, and the baby would turn as if listening. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. One morning in late December, Emily stood at the window of the sunroom, watching the snow fall. She thought about Catherine, James's late wife. About Richard. About the version of herself she had left behind in another life. She placed a hand on her belly. "I hope you never feel like you have to disappear," she whispered. "I hope you're brave enough to take up space. Even when it's hard. Especially then." James walked in, holding 2 mugs of tea. He kissed her temple and handed her one. "Still snowing." "Always is," she smiled. "At least up here." He placed an arm around her shoulder. They stood like that, quiet and warm, watching the world outside bury itself in white. And inside, something new was preparing to bloom. January came with ice. The trees around Willow Hill stood like skeletons dipped in glass, their bare limbs catching the morning light in brittle prisms. Snow covered the garden completely now, muting every sound, wrapping the house in a stillness so deep it felt sacred. Inside, Emily moved slower. She was almost 7 months along, and the weight of her body pressed differently each day, against her spine, against her ribs, against the memory of everything that had come before. But she didn't resent the heaviness. It reminded her that she was making something new, that even in winter, something inside her was blooming. James became her constant. He rose early to light the fire, made her oatmeal with honey and cinnamon, read aloud while she rested, and placed thick socks on her feet when she forgot to care for herself. There was a tenderness to his movements now, a quiet reverence that went beyond guilt or atonement. This was love, not born from impulse, but from witnessing. Every evening, they sat together in the sunroom, books in their laps, the baby occasionally nudging Emily's ribs like a reminder that they were no longer just two. One night, as snow fell outside like powdered stars, Emily turned to James and said, "We need to talk about the birth." He set down his book, immediately alert. "I want to do it here," she said. James blinked. "At the house?" "Yes, in the sunroom, with the windows open, if it's warm enough. I want it to be quiet. No machines, no strangers." He hesitated. "That's not small." "Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "I've had so much taken from me. I want to choose how this begins." James didn't argue. Instead, he found a midwife, a woman named Claire who had delivered dozens of babies across rural Vermont. When she arrived a few days later, she walked through the house like it was a church, running her hand along the banisters and asking gentle questions. "She's strong," Claire said after the first checkup. "This baby's rooted deep. You'll be fine." For the first time in weeks, Emily allowed herself to believe that. Around that time, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from California and addressed in handwriting Emily didn't recognize. Inside was a short note and a photograph. "Emily, I don't know if you'll ever want to hear from me again. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I've been thinking about you a lot. About what I could have been for you, what I wasn't. I'm in therapy. Real therapy. I'm trying to figure out who I am without all the anger. This photo was taken last week. I thought maybe one day your child might want to know what I looked like when I started trying to be better. No expectations. Just, thank you. For waking me up. Even if it was by walking away. Richard." The photograph showed him standing near a cliff overlooking the ocean, wind in his hair, a journal tucked under one arm. He looked older, but lighter. Emily folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. That night, she dreamed of water, of swimming in a lake alone, sunlight hitting the surface just right, her arms moving freely through the quiet. She woke with tears on her cheeks and peace in her chest. As February crept in, the midwife began visiting twice a week. James stayed close but respectful during the appointments. Claire taught him how to boil towels, time contractions, check Emily's pulse. He took notes. Serious, detailed, determined. "This is going to be your greatest essay," Emily teased him once. "I've never cared so much about getting something right," he said. Sometimes, she wondered what Catherine would think. If her ghost walked the halls, if she stood at the window watching them build something from the ashes of the old. Emily didn't feel haunted, only accompanied, as if the past had made space for the present. In the evenings, James played the piano now. Simple things. Scales. Old lullabies. Pieces Emily had once played herself, now softer through his fingers. It comforted her that the music stayed, that it shifted shape but never vanished. Then came the storm. It arrived without much warning, a nor'easter that roared through Vermont like a beast. Snow fell sideways. Trees bent. Power lines snapped. By morning, they were without electricity, without phone service, without a clear road out. But they had warmth, fireplaces, candles, old blankets that still smelled of cedar, and each other. Emily didn't panic. She sat by the fire, hands on her stomach, and said quietly, "If it starts tonight, we'll be okay." James sat behind her, arms around her shoulders. "We'll be more than okay." But the labor didn't begin that night, or the next. Instead, the storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. Branches coated in ice, sunlight catching on the snow like diamonds. And the house, still standing. Still theirs. One morning, while Emily slept, James stepped out into the garden with a shovel. The snow was waist-deep in places, but he carved a narrow path, first to the edge of the greenhouse, then toward the road. He didn't know why. Maybe it was a kind of prayer, or penance, or preparation. That evening, he returned with windburned cheeks and snow in his hair. Emily was awake, reading by the fire. "I made us a path," he said. She smiled. "Where does it go?" "Out," he replied. "In case we ever want to leave." She looked at him, the corners of her eyes soft. "Do you?" James shook his head. "Not yet." Later that night, as they lay together in bed, her back to his chest, his hand resting on the curve of her stomach, Emily whispered, "What if they ask where they came from?" "We'll tell them the truth," he said. "That they came from something broken, and made it whole." "Do you think they'll understand?" "Not at first. But one day." Emily closed her eyes, and in the quiet that followed, she felt the baby turn, like a small tide shifting inside her, answering something deeper than words. The baby came on the last day of February. It was just past midnight when Emily felt the first ripple of pain, low, steady, and unmistakable. She had been dreaming of the garden, green again, in full bloom. The shift from dream to contraction was so seamless it startled her awake with a quiet gasp. James stirred beside her. "What is it?" he asked, already alert. Emily placed a hand over her belly, her breath caught between fear and awe. "It's time." James didn't panic. He helped her up slowly, wrapped her in the robe she kept near the bed, and brought her to the sunroom they had prepared weeks earlier. The space was quiet and dim, warmed by the fireplace and lit by strings of soft white lights they had hung around the windows. The air smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax. The snow outside reflected the moonlight like a frozen sea. James called Claire, the midwife, using the old landline that still worked despite the spotty service. She answered after 2 rings, her voice calm even in the middle of the night. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, she said. "Start timing the contractions." By the time Claire arrived, Emily was breathing through them, eyes half closed, body swaying gently to the rhythm of her pain. She said very little. There was nothing to say. Her body had already taken over. Claire moved with quiet efficiency. She checked vitals, laid out towels, set warm water to boil in the kitchen. James remained close, but never in the way. He held Emily's hand when she asked. He stayed silent when she needed space. Hours passed. The contractions grew closer, deeper, harder. At one point, Emily gripped the edge of the chair and whispered, I don't know if I can do this. Claire placed a hand on her back. You already are. James knelt beside her, his voice steady. You're the strongest person I've ever known. It was not a compliment. It was a truth. Just before dawn, the final stage began. Emily knelt on the birthing mat, her forehead resting against James's shoulder, her breath coming in low, guttural moans. Claire coached her gently, never raising her voice, never pushing beyond what Emily could give. And then, with one final push and a cry that broke something open in the house itself, the baby came. A boy. He entered the world with his eyes wide open, fists clenched, skin flushed with life. Claire wrapped him in a soft towel and placed him gently in Emily's arms. James sat beside her, one hand cradling her shoulder, the other reaching out to touch the newborn's tiny foot. Emily looked down at her son, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Hello, she whispered. The baby blinked, as if seeing her from the other side of a long journey. James kissed her forehead. He's perfect, he said. They named him Aiden. It was a name Emily had dreamed years before, but never told anyone. Aiden. Little fire. The quiet light that stays when everything else is burned away. The next few days passed in a kind of sacred blur. Claire stayed with them for 2 nights, sleeping in the guest room, checking vitals, teaching Emily how to nurse, how to swaddle, how to rest between the endless tides of new motherhood. James took care of everything else. Meals, firewood, laundry, diapers. He moved through the house with a quiet grace, like he had been waiting his whole life for a purpose that finally arrived. And Emily, tired, raw, but alive in a way she had never been, sank fully into the rhythm of those early days. She spoke to Aiden in soft hums, read poetry aloud while he fed, walked the hallways with him tucked against her chest in the sling Claire had given them. The house, too, seemed to exhale. The creaks were softer, the light warmer. Even the garden, buried in snow, looked different from the windows, less like something dead, more like something waiting. On the 6th day, Margaret returned. She didn't call first. Emily was nursing Aiden in the sunroom when the car pulled up. James answered the door, and for a long moment, mother and son stood in silence, snow swirling between them. Then she stepped inside. Emily didn't stand. She didn't need to. Margaret entered the sunroom quietly, her eyes falling immediately on the baby cradled in Emily's arms. You named him? She asked. Aiden, Emily said. Margaret nodded once. Strong name. She sat slowly on the edge of the nearby chair. May I? Emily glanced at James, then back to Margaret, and gently passed the baby to her. Margaret held him like someone who had done it many times before, but never expected to do it again. He looks like both of you, she said. But there's something else too. Something softer. Emily smiled. Maybe that's Catherine. Margaret looked up, startled, but not offended. Her eyes shimmered with something Emily had never seen in her before. Something close to tenderness. I like to think she would have understood, Margaret said quietly. Eventually, they didn't talk about forgiveness, or mistakes, or scandal. There was no need. Aiden slept peacefully in his grandmother's arms, and for once, silence didn't mean distance. It meant arrival. After Margaret left, James stood by the window for a long time, watching her car disappear down the hill. Emily joined him, Aiden nestled against her shoulder. She held him like she's held grief before, she said. She has, James replied. We all have. Later that night, after the baby was asleep and the house was quiet again, James brought out the journal he had begun writing for Aiden. He had filled nearly 30 pages already. Letters, reflections, bits of poetry. Memories, too. The story of how he and Emily met. Of the music that brought them back to life. Will we tell him everything? Emily asked. One day, James said. When he's old enough to ask the right questions. And what will we say? James looked at her. We'll say that he was born from something complicated. But he made it simple. Emily smiled. He made it good. And in that moment, with the fire flickering low and their son sleeping just down the hall, they knew. The house on Willow Hill had not been a place of ruin. It had been a crucible, and what had survived the fire was love. Spring came to Willow Hill slowly, as if the earth itself were unsure whether it was safe to bloom again. The snow melted first from the stone steps, then from the corners of the garden, revealing broken roots and the first fragile shoots of green. Rain followed, tapping softly against the window panes in early mornings, loosening the hard earth with patience. Inside the house, the seasons shifted too. Aiden was 2 months old and growing fast. His eyes, once sleepy and unfocused, now followed movement with intent. His hands opened more often. His cries had patterns. His smile, though rare, could stop time. Emily had begun painting again, not for distraction or escape, but because she had something she wanted to remember. She painted Aiden's feet, his lashes in sunlight, the folds of the blanket that James had knit one stormy afternoon in late March. She painted James, too, always from memory. She painted his eyes when he was reading, his hands as they cradled Aiden's head, his shoulders as he stood in the doorway, watching them both with a kind of quiet devotion that still startled her. There were still hard days, nights when Aiden refused to sleep, days when Emily's body ached from fatigue, and the guilt of wanting space crept into her spine like a chill. There were moments when she cried for no reason, over spilled tea, or an old photo, or a line of poetry she couldn't finish reading aloud. James never asked her to explain. He held the baby when she needed a shower. He cooked simple meals when she had no appetite. He listened, and when she said, "I just feel like I'm disappearing again," he answered, "Then we'll find you together." In early April, they received a letter from Richard. It was addressed to Emily, but written for Aiden. She read it alone in the garden, the first real sun warming her shoulders. "Dear Aiden, I don't know what the world will tell you about me. Maybe nothing, maybe too much. But I want you to know that your mother is the bravest person I've ever known. She did what I couldn't. She broke a pattern. She made space for something new. That's what love is. It's not perfect. It's not always clean. But it's honest when it matters. I'm far away now, learning how to be a better man. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. Just your understanding, one day. And I hope, if you ever wonder where you came from, you know that it wasn't just from pain. It was from choice. From courage. From a woman who refused to be small. Be gentle with her. She taught herself how to be seen. Emily folded the letter and brought it inside, placing it in the journal James had started for Aiden. No commentary. No anger. Just a piece of the puzzle saved for later. Later that evening, she told James about the letter. He read it, slowly, then handed it back without a word. "I think Richard's trying," she said. "I hope he becomes the man his letter wants him to be." They sat by the fire that night and didn't speak much. Aiden slept between them in a woven bassinet, one hand curled beside his cheek. "I've been thinking about the future," James said. Emily looked up. "What about it?" "We could leave." The words hit her like wind. He continued, "We could sell the house. Move closer to town. Somewhere warmer. Somewhere with schools and bookstores and sidewalks." Emily let the idea sit between them for a long moment. Then, softly, she shook her head. "This house saved me," she said. "Not because it was kind, but because it let me fall apart. Because it let me rebuild." James watched her, waiting. "I want Aiden to grow up here," she said. "I want him to know the sound of the wind in the trees. I want him to learn what stillness means." James smiled, a slow and quiet thing. "Then we'll stay." They began restoring the house that spring. Together, James repaired the rotting porch steps. Emily painted the nursery with watercolors of trees and animals and stars. They reopened the greenhouse and filled it with herbs and vegetables. They cleared the pond, rebuilt the garden path, planted new rose bushes where the old ones had died. Sometimes, neighbors drove by and waved. Sometimes they stopped. "Thought no one lived here anymore," one of them said. Emily smiled. "We do now." And it was true. By May, the house was no longer a place of secrets. It had become a place of rhythm, of laughter, of music drifting through the open windows in the late afternoon. One morning, Emily found an old photo of Catherine in the attic, hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. She was young in the picture, seated on the back porch, a book in her lap and a smile on her lips. Emily framed it and placed it in the sunroom. James found it later that evening. He didn't say anything. He just stood in front of the photo for a long time, hand resting on the back of the chair where Emily usually rocked Aiden to sleep. When she came in and stood beside him, he said, "She would have liked you." Emily reached for his hand. "I hope she would have forgiven me." James didn't answer, but his grip on her fingers tightened, and for now, that was enough. At night, when the house was quiet and Aiden was asleep, Emily sometimes walked the garden alone. She listened to the wind moving through the trees, to the creak of old wood and the hum of the earth settling into its roots. She touched the petals of the new roses and whispered stories into the soil. She told the house thank you. And the house, old, tired, but still standing, seemed to answer. Not with words, but with peace. Summer arrived with a softness that felt like forgiveness. The trees around Willow Hill stood full and green, their branches whispering in the warm breeze. Wildflowers bloomed along the garden path, spilling over the stones with color and quiet insistence. The once abandoned greenhouse now pulsed with life, tomatoes ripening in the sun, basil leaves curling toward the light, lavender thick in the air. Aiden turned 6 months old in July. He had James's eyes and Emily's mouth. He laughed often, easily, with his whole body, as if joy was a language he'd been born fluent in. He liked to be held upright, to face the world. He reached for things now with purpose, tugged at James's beard, pressed his palm to Emily's collarbone as if trying to memorize the shape of her. Life had settled into rhythm. Mornings began with music, James at the piano, Aiden in his lap, Emily sipping tea by the window. Afternoons belonged to the garden, to walks through the woods, to storybooks and naps. Evenings were slow and golden, the sun sliding behind the hills while they cooked dinner together and read aloud from books that had once belonged to Catherine. They didn't speak about the past often, not out of fear, but because it no longer owned them. It lived in the walls, in the floorboards, in the hush between songs, but it was no longer a ghost. One morning in late August, James received an invitation to speak at a university symposium in Boston. A keynote lecture, the kind of offer he hadn't received in years. He sat with the letter for a long time before showing it to Emily. "I'd only be gone 2 nights," he said, "but I don't want to leave you alone here." Emily took the letter, read it, and handed it back. "You should go." He looked at her, uncertain. "You spent years giving everything to this house," she said. "To Catherine. Then to me. It's okay to give something to yourself now." James leaned forward, touched her cheek. "You're not mine to hold together." She smiled. "But I'm still yours." He left the next morning, just after sunrise. Emily stood on the porch with Aiden in her arms, watching the car disappear down the long gravel drive. The house felt different without James, not hollow, but quieter. Still, she didn't fear the solitude. It wasn't like before. That night, after putting Aiden to sleep, she walked the house slowly, checking windows, turning off lights. In the hallway, she paused at the framed photograph of Catherine in the sunroom. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I hope that's enough." She dreamed of Catherine that night, not as a ghost, but as a woman. They sat together on the porch swing, the sound of summer insects humming in the distance. Catherine held a steaming mug of tea, and Emily held nothing at all. "You think you took something," Catherine said, not unkindly. Emily looked down. "Didn't I?" Catherine shook her head. "You just arrived when the silence was too loud for anyone else to stay." Emily blinked. "Did he love you like he loves me?" Catherine smiled, not with sadness, but with knowing. "He loved me like the first story. He loves you like the one he wants to finish writing." When Emily woke, the sun was already climbing through the trees. Aiden was stirring in his crib, cooing softly to himself. And in her chest, something quiet had finally settled. James returned the following evening. He came through the door with flowers in one hand and a stack of books in the other, his eyes tired but bright. "How was it?" Emily asked as she took the flowers. "Strange," he said. "Like stepping back into a version of myself I'd already outgrown. But good." He nodded. "Yes, but the best part was coming back." That night, after Aiden was asleep, they sat together on the back porch. The garden glowed under the moonlight, crickets singing somewhere deep in the hedges. Fireflies flickered in the trees, and the scent of night-blooming jasmine floated in from the edge of the path. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked quietly. Emily looked at him. "What? This life? This version of everything?" She considered it. "I regret waiting so long," she said. "But not where I landed." He reached for her hand. They sat like that for a long time, the silence not empty, but full. A few days later, they received a letter from the state courthouse. The final divorce documents had been processed. Emily's name was now legally changed back to her maiden name, but with one addition: Aiden's surname was Harper. She framed the certificate, not as a declaration of the past, but of the way things had finally come full circle. By the end of September, they held a small gathering at the house. Just a few neighbors. Claire, the midwife. Margaret, who brought a homemade pie and told Aiden he would grow up to be a senator or a poet, though never both. They sat in the garden under hanging lanterns. Aiden passed gently from arm to arm, the air buzzing with quiet joy. When someone asked if Emily and James planned to marry, Emily only smiled. Maybe one day, she said. But right now, we're just learning how to live. And no one pressed further. That night, after the last guest had left and the house was quiet again, James found Emily in the nursery. She was standing by the window, watching Aiden sleep. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Do you remember the first night you played the piano here?" he asked. She nodded. "I remember thinking the keys would break if I touched them wrong." "They didn't." "No," she said, smiling. "They never did." And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of a life they had both fought for, both nearly lost, they understood something they hadn't dared to name before. They were no longer trying to outrun the past. They were building something beyond it. Not perfect, but true.